I'm going to wait a few minutes or a few seconds as we have attendees join, just to make sure we allow enough time for participants to, the numbers are rolling in. So just bear with us, please, as we allow that. For those who have already joined, please note we are recording our presentation today, and it is currently being broadcast live on YouTube. So thank you again to everyone who has joined so far. I'll go ahead and get started with the event. So this is our webinar today. This is the sort of more public-facing aspect of sort of a full day that we as a research team have going on. And we've all been working on this project called SWAN, which stands for Social Wellbeing in Aging Nations. And this has been a collaborative project by those from whom you'll hear today, who are UK-based, with other researchers based in Japan, to explore and examine the fundamentals behind social relationships in Japan and the UK. The project has been led by Dr. Noriko Cable from UCL and has been funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. Going back a step, for those who've joined and aren't very familiar with ILC, we are a specialist think tank on the impact of longevity, looking at the impact of longevity on society and thinking about what happens next. We benefit from being independent and politically neutral, using evidence to inform policy, working collaboratively to pioneer solutions. We think critically around these concepts of how to maximize the benefits from longevity, fighting against that narrative that aging is damaging for societies. And in doing so, we work to ensure longer lives are good for everyone by helping to future-proof policy and practice. So ensuring that our solutions last into the future and aren't more stopgap measures for today. And we benefit from this collaborative work I mentioned through our partners program, where we have a number of supporters you'll see there on the screen who engage us for insights and who help us promote some of our programming. To greet you all, I'm Dr. Brian Beach. I'm Senior Research Fellow at ILC, and I've benefited from working with Dr. Cable and the others you'll hear from today on SWAN. I think you're all here likely because you understand the importance of understanding social connections and social relationships. From a policy perspective, for example, there's been important work done on looking at loneliness. The commission, for example, the Joe Cox Commission on Loneliness, that was set up. We are also entering the holiday period where many of us, at least in the UK, will be familiar with the annual campaign by influential aging organizations like Age UK to highlight the issue of loneliness amongst older people. But when we think about understanding this, sort of how this impacts society and what we can learn from other societies, we then have to also reflect on whether or not when we explore these ideas, we're looking at the same things when we look from country to country. So this question of, are we comparing apples to apples, or are they apples and oranges? So that sort of helps set the scene for what we hear from today. Just a bit of housekeeping rules for everyone. I think many of us are more and more familiar with the online delivery via Zoom and these sort of tools. But if you do have any technical problems, there should be a bar of icons at the bottom of your screen where you can access the chat function. And if you highlight any issues you're having there, one of my colleagues can help you. On that bar, you'll also find the Q&A tab, which is where you can put in any questions you have for our presenters as we go through the day, and also during the panel discussion we'll have at the end. So also, you can check the hashtags there at the bottom of your screen, SWAN and social relationships, for those of you who want to facilitate a conversation on social media. And you'll also see on the left bottom of the screen our website, where you can find out more about our programs and future events. But want to start off first by asking you some questions. So we're going to be a little interactive today. So let me pull this first one up. And here you should be seeing now on your screen, we've got two questions there around sort of understanding the proportion of adults who report loneliness or social isolation, sort of comparing UK and Japan, and then also thinking more specifically around the proportion of adults who are who report loneliness and social isolation who are aged 65 plus, so thinking more explicitly about older people. This comes from a 2018 study done by the Kaiser Family Foundation. I've drawn on it because it's directly comparable because they conducted the surveys in both countries as well as the United States. And if for those who are familiar with this field, the numbers, they vary sometimes depending on how people have defined loneliness, how they've measured social isolation, et cetera, which I think for those who might be surprised by some of what the answers are, it really, I think, resonates with why we're having this webinar today. So I'm going to wait a few more seconds, I think, to allow more people to vote. I know there are two questions there, so it'll give you time. While you're doing that, while we're waiting for a few more to come in, I'll also highlight how we're going to go through the day. So we've got three great speakers with us. We've got Dr. Noriko Cable, Professor Twani Chandula, and Dr. Ula Timochuk, who will each give a presentation. After their presentation, we'll allow time for clarifying questions. So really, is there something from their presentation you didn't quite understand? Let's make sure that we all have learned what we need to learn. And then after all three of those and those three periods of clarifying questions, we'll then have a broader panel discussion. So I'll be drawing on your questions that you put into the Q&A to sort of to facilitate understanding, conversation amongst the whole group and on some of the broader concepts. So I'm going to end the polling now. We've got a lot of people who've come in. And let me just double check. So for question one, the majority got it right. Yes, 23% of people in the UK and 9% of people in Japan, of adults, report loneliness or social isolation. Again, it depends on how you measure this, that will impact how these numbers lay, but these are comparable. So we do hear from this survey at least greater levels of loneliness and isolation amongst the British adults. But looking to the second question here about the proportion of adults reporting loneliness and social isolation, I noted earlier this, at least from the UK perspective, I'm very familiar with Age UK's campaign around loneliness. And I think many of us, it's very common to think of loneliness as being an issue that impacts mainly older people. But the the correct answer is actually the very last one there, where about a quarter of older people in the UK are reporting loneliness and isolation, and about 1 in 5 in Japan. So, I think, the majority here sort of got the right idea where it's slightly higher in the UK than in Japan. But I think that sort of highlights that, we've got to ensure not only are we thinking about how we look and measure loneliness and social isolation, but we also have to think about this in a life course perspective, because it's not only older people. Oh, did I not share that? I don't think I shared the results. Sorry, there you go. So I don't think we've got to ensure that we're not just restricting this to an older person's issue. Now, before I move on to Dr. Cable's presentation, I want to ask one more polling question. And this I found along doing my research and preparation for today, which I think is really interesting. Again, from the Kaiser Family Foundation, in this survey, what proportion of people in each of these countries say that they think people who are lonely have themselves to blame? That's this question here. I think it's very, there's sort of a demonstrate, when you see the answer, you'll understand sort of how this aligns with potentially, cultural perspectives that have to be taken into account. And also, I think it really informs us when we think about the degree to which potential solutions for reducing loneliness and social isolation need to manifest. So I'll give a little bit more time there. So most people, I think, a lot of people have voted. So I'll end that and I'll share the results this time so you can see. And we have a very informed audience, I have to say, because the majority got this right. Yeah. So interestingly, there's, on the one hand, we can think about trends toward individualization that might take place in certain welfare states versus others, thinking about these different cultural perspectives. But I think I was quite struck by this, that only 11% of people in the UK think that loneliness is, people are responsible for their own loneliness is one way of looking at this, whereas there's a much larger proportion in Japan, 4 times as much. So that's giving you a little bit of flavor of some of the statistics I was able to find to start us off. But now I think we'll move on to our first presentation, which will be from Dr. Noriko Cable. So Noriko and I have known each other now for quite some time, and we've been working quite closely together. She is a senior research fellow at University College London. So Noriko, if you could come on in. Over to you.
Thank you, dear. Thank you, Brian. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to this SWAN virtual policy seminar. As Brian introduced me, I'm Dr. Noriko Cable, Senior Research Fellow at the International Center for Life Course Study, University College London. And also I'm the PI for this ESRC-funded project, UK-Japan Social Connection and Wellbeing Across Aging Nations, UK-Japan SWAN for short. Because of the pandemic and the current guidance, we are meeting today virtually, but I hope you will gain a lot, same as from the usual face-to-face meeting. Next slide, please. So you must be thinking, although the Brian briefly explained to you all, you must be thinking, what is this SWAN project all about? As he said, this is an ESRC-funded project partnership project started January 2019. This is to the strengthen the UK-Japan partnership by enhancing existing and identify new partnerships between these countries. And it has the aim of to facilitate a series of knowledge exchange opportunities. Next slide, please. The reason behind of this project is we know the social relationship is a fundamental desire to form a relationship. We have a fundamental desire to form a relationship that's called social relationships. Also, we know the social integration and isolation, the social relationships overall, especially the case of loneliness. This is all well linked to the health and well-being. And we have the kinship and the Japan values kinship over friendship, while the Western countries over the friendships. But this given this cultural contextual meaning of social relationships, and this effect should be explored in detail using existing data from each country. And given today's social demography, increasing the aging population and increasing population of never married and solo living, and this context should be explored, what are the impacts on health outcomes. Next slide, please. So although Brian and very modestly introduced himself, but he's as well as him and Dr. Professor Chandra from University of Manchester, Dr. Timo Schuch from the Center for Performance Science, Royal College of Music and Imperial College London. We all work together to make this happen. And also we have Japanese partner from the Osaka Medical University and University of Tokyo. Next slide, please. When we proposed the SWAN project, we promised a couple of things. One of them is to establish a website, which is our focal point. SWAN also have a Twitter account, which I would like you to tweet about today. Hashtag SWAN, hashtag social relationships, and talk about this, mentioning the ILC UK and the Soccer Network. We had two methods symposium, one in Japan, another one in the UK. We uploaded slides and videos for the UK method symposium if you're interested in our work. That is on our soccer website. In this presentation, I would like to focus on our main project theme, facilitating cross-national research. I structured my talk from 2 points, that are data resources for cross-national comparative work, followed by the research ideas. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about available data resources that you might delve in. Next slide, please. As some of you might have heard this already, the best data set that are reflective of the aging population in England is English Longitudinal Study of Aging, ELSA for short. ELSA targets aged 50 and above and follow them up every 2 years and collects rich information on social networks, support, household composition, and health. Currently, 9 waves are already deposited and accessible via UK data services. Also recently, COVID-related information is also released as well. JSTAR, Japanese Study of Aging Retirement, is the sister aging cohort study in Japan that is started from 2007. Data were collected similarly as ELSA, and 4 waves of data were already deposited. Next slide, please. But cross-national comparative work is not limited to just between England and Japan. Gateway to Global Aging Data, the platform for aging studies across the country, showcase harmonized datasets really available for us. That includes ELSA and JSTAR. Next slide, please. And what I mean by harmonization is Brian said comparing apple and pears. So the harmonized data, it's making the pear as an apple, so that everyone is in the same ground, comparing the same thing. So data are comparable. So that is the deposit to the Gateway to Global Aging Data. As you can see in this list, the harmonized data sets included from America, Europe, for example, in this middle of the screen share, and also from Asia, that's the closer called from South Korea, and Charles, that is from China, and India, that is the bottom of the list, called Lassi. Next, thank you. Gateway to Global Aging Data website give us the way to obtain harmonized data. So if you see this screen on the Gateway to Global Aging Data platform, you can just click and then see how to navigate to the harmonized data set. Next, please. And they provide the detailed documentation as well as the resources to the linked data set. Also they have the documentation is for the harmonized variables. So we feel interested in how the harmonization is taking place and how are harmonized. We can read this and we know what were done. Next slide, please. I would like to see this table, just although it's a bit blur, that you can see in the Gateway to Global Aging Data website, collated by the surveyor. This can give us possible cross-national comparative study. For example, if we want to observe change over 6 years, we can take data that is from the top to the bottom, 2012 to 2013. We can take data from America, Costa Rica, South Korea, as well as England, Japan. If we want to take advantage of the number of data set, that is the bottom line of the 2012 and 13, just we can use America, Mexico, Europe, Costa Rica, South Korea, Ireland, and China, as well as England, Japan. So that's all possibilities that what we can do with the data sets. Next slide, please. So next, I would like to introduce you what were asked in ELSA and JSTOR for social network and support related questions. For social network related information, 2 data sets collected similar questions like family composition and contact with family members. Between English and Japanese, the context of contact is slightly different, as the question was written as communication in ELSA, while it is written as contact to meet their own needs in JSTOR. But if we are to examine the behavioral aspect of social contact, I think that is comparable. Next slide, please. As for the social supported related information, in aspect of emotional social support, ELSA asks more detailed information, exploring the positive and negative aspects of emotional support, while JSTOR asks practical social support, which ELSA did not. Both ELSA and JSTOR asked about quality of partnerships, closeness, and satisfaction, and both asked about provision of informal care. So what we can compare are emotional support, quality of partnership, and provision of informal care. Next slide, please. So what else are comparable? There are more comparable items on health outcomes. They are ADL, IADL, mental health, health conditions, BMI, health-related behaviors such as exercise, drinking alcohol, and smoking, and cognitive function. And as I said earlier, in the social network, family information are also closely comparable. Next slide, please. Next, I would like to share the information about another Japanese aging cohort study that have been used for the comparative work with ELSA, that is Japan Gerontological Evaluation Study, J-AGES for short. J-AGES collects over 100,000 people who are aged 65 and over across over 30 municipals in Japan. Data are collected every 3 years. Data sets are semi-closed, which require application to use a data set, and further information is available from their website, but you can also ask me as well. In terms of social relationship, few research example from our work can show social isolation and loneliness are harmonized and comparable between J-AGES and ELSA. In both studies, social isolation consists of the following items that are not married, not living with children, not received social support, having limited face-to-face contact with friends, and having no social participation. So we created the social index for the social isolation. As for loneliness, JH is used. The translated version of 3-item UCLA loneliness scale that is already used in ELSA. So we translated the items and validated, empirically validated the scale. So that's the UCL loneliness scale is comparable between JH and ELSA, which JH is used in their 2019 survey. Next slide, please. In a collaborative study with Saito and others, which is about to be published, we found more Japanese people were socially isolated than English people. Also, overall, more men were socially isolated as well as those who had poor health. Although more Japanese people were socially isolated, the negative impact from social isolation on the longevity is somewhat greater in ELSA than JHs. Taking an interest in social isolation is relevant to the current situation inflicted by the COVID pandemic, meaning lockdown. Next slide, please. So in summary, we are in a fortunate position to conduct cross-national work in examining social relationships and health because we have harmonized data sets and for meaning that we can really delve into the global gateway to aging data platform. And research application of social isolation and loneliness, it's show us the very complex picture of the association between the social isolation and health outcomes and the towards loneliness. And this is very relevant to our interests, especially the healthy aging. Especially that is so relevant in the COVID pandemic because we always hear about increasing poor mental health because of lockdown and increase of loneliness among the elderly and disabled people because of the lockdown. Next slide, please. I would like to the ESRC for funding our project and the IRIS UK for being partner for this project, and Chris Yarrington, who is a communication guru for supporting our project to the promoting our project, and our advisory board, Professor Mel Bartley, Professor Amanda Sacker, Professor Aaron Williamson, and Dr. Morten Wollendorf. Next slide, please. If you have any questions, you can email me, and also tweet about this. And the SOCA has a mailing list, so if you are interested in being in contact of their projects or the further development, and please visit this website www.soca-net.org and sign up today. Thank you very much for listening, and I will take the questions.
Great, thanks, Noriko. So there you have it, everyone. A nice sort of overview of what we've done, so some of the work we've done in the project so far, and outlining some of the critical points around why this is important, and offering you up some resources that you can use when you want to do your own research in the future. I said early on we were going to be interactive, so there's another poll. I'm going to quiz you on what she said slightly. So that should be coming up now for you to look at it, really sort of just to try to reinforce some of these messages around the differences, for example, between social support, social networks and social supports, and then also some of the examples around measuring social support and comparative cross-national research. While people are looking at that and considering their answers, I'm going to start looking at the Q&A. Again, I want to sort of use this opportunity to get any clarifying to get some answers and clarifications around the content of Noriko's presentation. So please do use the Q&A function here to submit those. I'll give a little bit more time so you can look at those quiz questions I put on there, and I'll go through these questions here. So Noriko, I've got one question here that I think might be, because it's related to the fundamental question of comparability with different measures. We've got a question asking whether or not the measures that exist to capture social connections that we've highlighted, are they applicable to lower and middle income countries? So to what extent do our lessons here around Japan and England apply to less economically developed contexts?
If they like social isolation, it's the really the related demographic, the characteristics of the people. Like if there's some economical reasons, the people who cannot marry, or they cannot live with the children, or they something, or they not able to participate in a social organization because you are isolated. That is the all kind of the contextually, that is the most socioeconomic status of the people, they are contributing to social isolation. But in terms of the concepts, it's the defined, and if you are giving some factors that affecting the state of social isolation, that is modifiable in the conditioning the variables. So I think the research wise, it is possible. That thing is, we know that the evidence is related to health outcomes. So some of these things that varies, the cultural context can be modifiable within the methodological application. That is the Professor Chandra will going to kind of mention about it. So I think broadly it's the negative impact can be the comparable, and can be explored even from the different countries. That's my point of view. However, I really like to kind of having the further debates if you're interested.
Yeah. We've had one question also, since I know that we worked with Osaka Medical School, asking if we had worked with an organization called Studio L, who were based at University of Osaka. Were they at all involved in SWAN?
No, I think the SWAN project is more closely working with the J-Ages people who visited the UCL last summer. So that is the research work I presented today. But the J-Ages people really doesn't limit to the one university. It's really coming from the north to the south. Because the data collected from across the municipals, and each investigators who are interested in that municipal that went into and have a partnership with the municipal and collecting data and depositing to the J-Ages. So the J-Ages is very, very, very unique research group, and also they runs their longitudinal data study, aging study. So, and Osaka Medical Group, the people and Osaka University people are involved, but not particular a research group from the Osaka University. Yeah.
We had, and speaking of J ages, we've had one question around asking how many longitudinal studies have looked at specifically the 65 plus cohort. I mean, I can say most of the studies on the global gateway to aging have been, many of them, at least if not all, are focused on people aged 50 plus.
Yes.
But do you have any further things to say on studies that perhaps take more of a old perspective?
Because of this 65 plus is based on the Japanese health policy about giving the retirement and also the health insurance changes the age 65 based on occupational basis to after retirement they moving to the more public-based healthcare insurance plan. So that is why the aging research in Japan looking particularly interested in 65 and above the aging population. However, I would say there might be some longitudinal study conducted locally, but not like the J ages to the nationwide longitudinal study that I'm aware of.
Okay, great. All right. Well, there's some great questions in the Q&A, and I will return to them at the end. They really, I think, touch on some broader issues that I would like to make sure we invite the other speakers to comment on. So I'm going to end the polling now and share the results for everyone. Let's see how we did. Okay. Yeah, I think I see some people fell for my little trick with that last option on the first question, but it is the social network is essentially identifying these frequency of contacts. So how often you meet or speak on the phone. That last one's a bit tricky because it's related to reliance, and therefore it goes more into the support element of social networks. And the second, yes, I think, I took that pretty much straight from Noriko's presentation. So yeah, it really is recognizing that some of these differences need to be explained with cultural perspectives in mind. So well done, everyone. We're doing great so far. But thank you again, Noriko. I'll bring you into the panel discussion after the other two presentations.
Thank you, Brian.
So yes, so now without any further ado, I will turn over to our next speaker, who is Professor Twani Chandula from Manchester. I'll stop sharing my slides because I know you want to manage it yourself, Twani. So there you go.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Brian and Noriko, for inviting me to talk today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining in today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the methodological issues around comparing research from different countries in relation to healthy aging. Some of the questions I think you've been asking, such as, can you really compare social networks, questions of social networks in different countries? So let's, without further ado, let me go to my next slide. So I'll be dividing the talk up into two parts. Firstly, a methodological component, looking at what are the sources of measurement errors in when we're doing these kinds of research, and some specific examples following on from my research. So first of all, I'm going to look at some standard questions around life satisfaction and well-being. So there's a standard sort of life satisfaction scale that's often asked, how satisfied are you with your life overall? And if we look at the same question and its responses across different regions of the world, we see that there's a tendency for people in Western Europe to respond that they're quite well satisfied with overall with their life. From you can see the responses are highly skewed here. And then if you see other regions of the world, say in sub-Saharan Africa, we see that that there's a tendency to select answers that are towards the less satisfied range of the scale. But to what extent are these differences real differences? You know, can we say that people in Western Europe are more satisfied than people in sub-Saharan Africa? So, Noriko outlined many of these studies that are now available to do this kind of research, and it's increasingly possible to conduct these kinds of comparative studies. But that doesn't mean that there are no inherent risks, because there's the increased risk of drawing the wrong conclusions because we've got systematic measurement error. So here are some standard questions that are often included in these comparative studies. So these come from a measure of health and well-being called the SF36, the short form 36. And one set of questions is around energy and emotions. And if you read these questions in English, you'll see they're full of colloquial terms like, did you feel full of pep? Here's another one. Have you felt down in the dumps that nothing could cheer you up? So these expressions, you know, they're colloquial. You need to see whether they can be translated across into the Japanese context. These are the Japanese translations. I myself, I don't read in Japanese, so I don't know. But the standard way to do this is to do forward and backward translations, so that you translate them across forward into a different language, and then you translate them backwards into the original language to see whether or not these concepts hold, and ideally this should be done in an independent process. So the person doing the forward translation and the person doing the backwards translation don't know what the original translations happened. So that's the gold standard. And even then, there can still be problems. So the idea is that whatever observations that we get, you know, the responses to those questions reflects the true score, plus hopefully some random error. Yeah, so the error is some, you know, variability around the true score. So those of you who are slightly don't like equations, don't worry. You know, I'm not going to be testing you on your equations, but the idea is that, you know, there's always some sort of error, you know, around observations, things that we observe, and we're hoping that error is a random error. But very often that error really isn't random; it's systematic. So if it's random error, that's not such a big problem. But if it's a systematic error or bias, that's increasingly a big problem. So what is random error? So random error is any factors that randomly affect the measurement of a variable. So for example, your mood can inflate or deflate how you respond to one of those questions. So what random error does is it adds variability to the data, but doesn't affect the average performance for the group. So for example, here we've got a distribution of how you know, a particular people answer a particular question, and there's no random error here. And this distribution of the same question with some random error, you can see that there's greater variability, but the peak or the mean of the answer to that particular question is the same as the distribution for the black lines. So what this means is that the random error doesn't affect the average. It only affects the variability around the average. So we can meaningfully compare the average across different contexts, different countries. The problem is what happens when we have systematic errors. So we've got factors that systematically affect the measurement of the variable across the sample that we're taking. And this systematic error is known as bias. And for a typical example is when we're asking questions that have a cultural or normative bias. Systematic error does affect the average performance, so does affect how people answer a particular question. So here again, we have a distribution of responses to a particular question, X, and there's no systematic error. And here we've got another distribution where we've got systematic error. You can see here that the mean or the peak of the X responses is different in these two samples. So here, the systematic error does affect the average. You can see the averages are different, and that's what we call a bias. So having illustrated sort of the differences between systematic and random measurement error, I just want to highlight a few measurement issues that I've come across in some of the comparative research that I've done. And this is an example of a study I did some years ago where we compared the health and well-being of civil servants working in Britain, Japan, and Finland. So the populations were very much similar. They were all civil servants working in these different contexts, in these different countries. And we wanted to see what are the factors that sort of explain higher or lower levels of well-being. And we used this SF36 score. So you get a physical health score. So a higher score indicates better health. A lower score indicates poorer health. And right away, you can see that there are differences between men and women in each of these contexts. So men tend to have better than average scores on physical health, and women tend to have worse than average scores on physical health. But apart from these gender differences, we can also observe country differences. So it looks like Japanese men report worse physical health compared to their counterparts in Britain and Finland. And similarly, Japanese civil servant women report worse physical health compared to British and Finnish civil service women. And if we look at the mental health score, we see that there's a much bigger difference as well. So Japanese women in particular seem to be reporting much lower levels of mental health compared to their counterparts in Britain and in Finland. So to what extent is it really true that Japanese men and women report poorer health compared to British and Finnish men? Is this really a real finding, or is it something to do with the way how the questions were worded? Is this really random error, or is it systematic error? So that's one of the questions I had when I looked at these results. And if we look at the way how these questions are answered, we get at some idea about whether this is really systematic or random measurement error. So I showed you some of the questions from the SF36 earlier, and here's another set of questions. And people are asked, I seem to get sick a little easier than other people, and they're asked to answer that question in relation to definitely true, mostly true, don't know, mostly false, and definitely false. And if we look at the response styles in these three different countries, we see that in Japan, there's a definite preference to answer don't know or the middle of the scale rather than the extremes of the scale that we find in Britain and Finland. So there's a definite cultural response here towards non-extreme forms of responding to scale that needs to be taken into account. So really, when you've got just one measurement item, one question to ask, you really can't distinguish between systematic and random error. You really need to have multiple questions asked in order to really distinguish between whether you can measure these things, compare these things across different contexts. So, but very often we're just limited to a single item question. How satisfied are you with your life overall? How lonely are you feeling? How do you rate your health? So these are single item questions, and it's really hard to compare across different contexts because you can't really distinguish between systematic and random error when you've got one single measurement item. You can't, when you do have just one single question, you can look at how it does in comparison to things it should be predicting. So you can look at the correlations with expected predictors. So I'm going to take the example here of self-rated health. It's a very common question. In English, you would say, in general, would you say your health is either excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor? Now, there's been a lot of work around translating this into the Japanese context, and some terms like fair in English is not easy to translate into Japanese, and some terms like poor doesn't have the same cultural connotation, so there's a very careful selection of the response items in both languages. But even then, how do we know that it's really comparable across England and Japan, for example? So my PhD student did some research on that to look at the correlations between self-rated health and a range of other measures of health. And you looked at biomarkers like grip strength, depression, and health behaviors like body mass index and smoking. And he compared data from the English longitudinal study of aging and the Japanese study of aging and retirement, and looked at sort of trajectories of what happens as people get older. Are these correlations between self-rated health, that question, that single item question that just has these responses, the correlations between this question and body mass index, smoking, grip strength, and depression, are they similar in these two countries? And the quick answer, which you won't be able to tell from this table, apologies for that, but you might be able to tell from these graphs that are derived from this table, is that there are comparable associations between self-rated health and things like grip strength. So we've got grip strength at the top over here, women in England and women in Japan, and men in England and men in Japan. You can see that these lines are comparable across these different contexts. And also, we've got similar associations between self-rated health and depression scores in England and Japan for women and for men. So just looking at these predicted lines. So over here we have the people with the lowest levels of grip strength, so they have the poorest health, and they also have the poorest self-rated health. And you can see that these lines decline as grip strength increases. So the probability of responding that you have poor self-rated health decreases in the same way for women in England and Japan and for men in England and Japan. And if we look at depression, we can see that people who say that they're depressed in England and Japan are more likely to say that they have poor self-rated health, both for women and both for men. So the correlations look very similar. So it does look like you can compare self-rated health in Japan and England in relation to grip strength and depression. But in relation to health behaviors like body mass index, which is the top over here, and smoking status, which is the bottom over here, they look very different. So the big difference here with body mass index is that in Japan, we have very few Japanese women and Japanese men who have a body mass index over 35 or so. But not only that, you can see that the slope for England is very different compared to the slope for Japan. So in England, people with high body mass index are much more likely to rate their health as poor, whereas in Japan, people with either women or men with high body mass index are not as likely to rate their health as poor compared to England. Although, the big difference is really there's virtually no Japanese men and women with very high body mass index. And in terms of smoking status, the English women are here in blue, and you can see here that as women smoke more, so greater than 20 cigarettes a day, they're more likely to rate their health as poor. Whereas for Japanese women and Japanese men, there's no correlation between smoking status and poor self-rated health. So really, it's this meaning of poor self-rated health does seem to differ in relation to smoking status and maybe in relation to obesity as well. And that sort of differences by smoking status really reminds me of the Japanese smoking paradox. So very often people report that in Japan, even though there's high proportions of people who are smoking every day, there doesn't seem to be a much increased risk of deaths from tobacco-related diseases, and that the relative risk for tobacco-related diseases in Asian populations, Japan in particular, seems to be much lower compared to Western populations. And I had a look at some of the explanations, and some of the explanations seem to highlight sort of differences in the way nicotine is available in Japanese cigarettes manufacturers, or perhaps some genetic differences in the way how nicotine is absorbed into the biology. But really, you know, when we look back at that previous result, which really says that the correlation between smoking status and poor self-rated health is very different in Japanese and English contexts. It does look like the meaning of being a smoker was also different in the two contexts. So we can't just look at tobacco-related differences between the two contexts. So just to summarize, the meaning of self-rated health does seem to differ between English and older Japanese adults. So we cannot directly compare the levels of single item questions like self-rated health between the countries because of systematic bias. Now, when you've got multi-item scales like the short form 36, it is impossible in theory to correct for systematic bias. But even in the results that I showed you, there still is this problem of systematic bias occurring because there's a strong preference against choosing the extremes of the scale. So we have this new problem is that many of the scales do not display high levels of measurement equivalence. So with that, I'd just like to thank my collaborators and colleagues and open up to any questions.
Great, thanks so much, Tarani. I got to see a lot of what Tarani has presented for the first time last year when we were doing our symposium in Japan. I think then you went some more detail about some of the techniques you can use to try to accommodate for some of this. I just, as a quantitative, you know, I've got a lot of interest in the quantitative applications. I just found it so fascinating. Let me put my screen back up. And again, for all of the audience members, I've got more quizzing for you. So this is the last one, actually. Sorry if so a couple of questions for you on, oh, it's not gonna work oh no, sorry. There, that should be working. So a couple of questions on Tarani's presentation, just to sort of try to help reinforce the learning here. That's what today is all about. And again, do please put your questions for Tarani into the Q&A. I've been making a list of some of the broader themes that we'll need to touch in the broader discussion later. But if there is any particular point you want clarified from his presentation, do put that in now.
So Brian, I saw one of the questions was about the civil servants. Am I really comparing the same group of people in the different contexts? So if that's okay, I could answer that one.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So yes, so those studies were designed to be directly comparable. So the quick answer is yes. We had civil servants of different levels of seniority. So in the English context, you know, so it's not only the top mandarins, but also there was a recruitment of a lot of administrative and support staff at the lowest grades of the civil service, and this was repeated in both the Finnish and Japanese context as well.
I might go ahead while we're allowing people to put in their quiz answers to Ronnie. I might direct this one your way. It's a question around effective mechanisms for recruiting participants. So I don't know if you have any perspective on that, the extent to which that might impact some of these distributional differences you've highlighted, or whether you know of how recruitment varies across countries, across the different studies.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's not an easy question because recruitment into study samples is highly selective, and for older people, especially when we're talking about longitudinal studies, there's a big problem of dropout. So a lot of people drop out for a whole range of reasons, but the most common being either they're too busy. In which case, it's the busyness is largely because of working status. So actually, there's often a problem of selective dropout for people of working age, but for perhaps people who are retired or who might have more time, the other big selection problem is health conditions, of course. So people fall ill and they become too ill to participate later on, and that is a source of selective systematic bias, of course, because we're interested in people's health, and if the people with poor health drop out, then we're only examining the sample of very healthy older people, so it becomes really biased. So the question was about how do we ensure we have better sample selections across the study. It's partly about firstly making sure we have an adequate sampling frame. So a sampling frame is an instrument that from which we sample. We can do some sort of random sample so that we can get a representative sample of the wider population. And all of the studies that Noriko mentioned did have sort of a well-regarded sampling frame, which enabled some sort of random sampling to occur that allows for making inferences back to the wider population. So that's crucial. But the second aspect is once you've got people that are selected to be in the study, how do you maintain their interests? I mean, so how do you keep them interested in the study? And that's again a whole range of communications that can be done. In the civil servant study that I was part of, we not only had a newsletter, but we communicated the results of our studies back to participants really regularly, so that they remained engaged. So so that the participation rate remained high across multiple waves, so that people. Even when people fell ill, they still felt a commitment to participate in the study. Maybe they couldn't come in and to do a lot of the clinical measurements, but they could sort of answer questions through the telephone, for example.
And I know, at least given my experience using ELSA, I'm not exactly sure the extent to which this is true for all of the other sister studies, but one of the sometimes one of the challenges in the use of ELSA for a topic of interest like this is the fact that it's only applicable to people living in mainstream housing. Yeah. So again, it doesn't apply to sort of older people who might be in care homes or other residential settings, and that sort of always has to be there in the back of your mind when you're thinking about these figures around loneliness and social isolation.
That's correct, yes.
Great. So I think I've not seen any other specific questions for you, Tarani. So I think I'll go ahead and into the polling and share the results with everyone. And we've got such a brilliant audience today. It's so wonderful because, yeah, the majorities have got the right answers here. So yes, as Tarani noted, the systematic measurement error shifts the average, and doing so introduces bias. And there have been questions I know I've dealt with over the years around whether or not there's use in these single item subjective measures like self-rated health, but I think we've got plenty of evidence that they are useful. However, in cross-national research, we've got to be careful because they can introduce systematic bias. So great, thanks so much, Tarani. I think we'll go ahead and move on to our next speaker, Dr. Ula Timoshuk. So let me close this, sorry, thanks. So Ula, I think you were also going to share your own slides and go through them. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, go ahead. So I will stop. There you go.
Great. Can you all see my screen now? Yep, fantastic. Good morning, everyone. Yes, and thank you so much for this opportunity, Brian. And today I thought I will talk about some aspects of the work that I have done as part of the Hearts project. So looking specifically at how arts engagement can benefit well-being in older adults. And let's see. Right, so the Hearts project stands for the Health, Economic and Social Impact of the Arts. And it was funded by the AHRC and led by the Center for Performance Science, which is a partnership between the Royal College of Music and Imperial College London. So this is our team. The team was really interdisciplinary. It consisted of performance scientists, sociologists, epidemiologists, health economists, and qualitative researchers. And the main purpose of this project was really to try to systematize and organize what we know about the association between arts engagement or cultural engagement, health and well-being, social relationships and resilience, as well as the health economic impact of these associations and how they might look like in different populations. As some of you may know, over the last decade, there's been an increasing interest in this ever-growing field of arts and health. And some of the reports, such as all-party parliamentary group reports on arts, health and well-being, have really been instrumental in collating all the different types of evidence that are out there on how arts can be beneficial for health and well-being. And ever since, there's been an increasing activity around understanding how we can measure arts engagement and how we can design intervention studies that will be the most robust and that will help us to really understand the pathways between arts engagement and how it impacts on health and other outcomes such as loneliness or social connectedness. And I would say that the overwhelming focus within this field has been really on older adults. So it's really great because to date we have a lot of really good evidence, and as I said, it's ever growing. So for this presentation, I thought I will share predominantly our findings from secondary data analysis. And for that, we have used ELSA study, which Noriko has introduced. So I will skip this, as you will all know now what ELSA is about. And luckily, ELSA also measures arts engagement at every study wave. And it measures it with these 3 items. So it asks about visits to the cinema, art gallery or museum, and theater, concert, or the opera. So we started our investigations for the Hearts project with trying to understand mental health of older adults. As some of you will know, approximately 1 in 4 people in England aged 65 and above are considered to be depressed. And the prevalence of depression is also considered to increase with age. I think also there's quite a lot of evidence showing that depression is underdiagnosed and undertreated in older adults. So it is really a important public health problem as it increases also the risk of early and preventable morbidity and mortality that is associated with depression. So one of the first things that we investigated in ELSA is we wanted to understand, is frequent arts engagement associated with reduced risk of developing depressive symptoms over time? And even though there are a lot of short-term interventional studies that have pointed at the importance of especially music engagement for preventing depression symptoms in older adults and certain groups at risk of developing depressive symptoms, such as first-time parents. There's still relatively little evidence that comes from robust, large-scale epidemiological studies. So we thought that would be a nice opportunity to study this question in ELSA. And just to quickly show you, depression is measured in ELSA using the Center for Epidemiological Studies depression scale, which is a well-established scale, and it basically measures 8 different somatic and affective symptoms, and people who score 3, who have 3 or more of these symptoms present, are considered to be at risk of developing depression. So for these analyses, we have used data across 10 years, so 6 study waves from wave 2 to wave 7, and that was just over 2,000 participants. And what we found was that we have, for these analyses, we have created an overall arts engagement score where we combined people's engagement with cinema, galleries, museums, theater, concerts, and opera into a one overall arts engagement score. And we found that people who, at the beginning of the study, reported that they engage with arts once a month or more often, compared to those who never engaged, had 50% lower odds of developing depression over 10 years. And those who engaged every few months, compared to those who engaged never, had 34% lower odds of developing depression over that decade. And we've adjusted these analyses for different socioeconomic, demographic, health, and social factors. And we believe these are a fairly robust associations. But as we have discussed throughout this morning, we always have to be mindful of residual confounding by socioeconomic factors. And as Tarani has mentioned, we always have this attrition bias in longitudinal studies that leads to healthier people being included in these analyses more than those who might drop out from the study due to health reasons and other factors. But we've tried to control for that as much as we can. And these are the findings that we found. Now, moving on to other analysis, we recognize that preventing depressive symptoms in older adults is naturally a very important aspect of public health. However, simultaneously, it's very important not to lose sight of fostering positive well-being and fostering resilience in the population and trying to understand factors that might contribute to that as well. And actually, the association between arts engagement and well-being is probably one of the most studied in this field. And there is an overwhelming amount of evidence coming from short-term intervention studies, from qualitative studies, and most of them naturally use small sample sizes and are not really able to follow participants over long periods of time. So another question that we were interested in examining is trying to get an estimation of the longevity of the well-being impacts of arts engagement. And once more, we were able to do that in ELSA. And the way we've defined well-being, we've tried to be as inclusive as we can be and look at the hedonic aspects of well-being, so positive affect and life satisfaction, as well as eudaimonic aspects, so the aspects of well-being that are more to do with self-realization and perceptions of control and autonomy over someone's life. And for this analysis, we have looked at arts engagement across the 6 waves, so across 10 years, to try to divide people into those who engaged frequently with the arts, but only at one wave. So their frequent arts engagement, we called it, was short term. And those people whose frequent engagement occurred at more or less half or less of the study waves. So their frequent arts engagement was considered to be repeated, and those whose frequent arts engagement was sustained. So those people who across all these years engaged with arts frequently. And just a quick reminder, these are the questions. And for these analysis, we have looked at these 3 arts activities separately. And just to show you the distribution of these groups in ELSA. So the majority of people really report no engagement or infrequent engagement across these 10 years. And that ranged from 50% for theatre, concerts, and opera engagement to 61% for galleries and museums. And in terms of the sustained engagement, once more, it was the engagement with theatre, concerts, and opera that was the most, out of all these activities, people were most likely to engage in a sustained manner with this activity. But there wasn't really that much of a difference. So between 15 to 22% of people reported sustained engagement with these activities. And in terms of the associations with well-being, we found that over time, there wasn't a statistically significant association for the engagement with cinema. And we also didn't find any statistically significant associations with the short-term engagement, so here in gray. However, we found that repeated engagement, so here in purple, was already, so to say, sufficient to impact on or to be associated with well-being over time. So specifically, we found that repeated engagement with galleries and museums was associated with higher levels of control and autonomy and self-realization, and repeated frequent engagement with theatre, concerts, and opera was associated with higher levels of perceived control and autonomy. And then finally, for sustained engagement, so the most frequent engagement across the majority of study waves, that was associated with both hedonic aspects of well-being, such as life satisfaction and positive affect, as well as the eudaimonic aspects of well-being. And in these findings have in many ways supported what other researchers have referred to arts engagement as a perishable commodity. So they suggest that really that policies should be put in place that support people's access to arts engagement, but also support them in a continuous, ongoing engagement over time, that perhaps the benefits that are derived from arts engagement are mainly there for engagement when it's sustained, so that perhaps some of these associations that were found in previous studies are more short-lived than we previously realized. And some people describe that as a perishable commodity. So moving on to social impact, and that was another objective of the Hearts project. I've realized from Brian's presentation, it's actually quite interesting to reflect that how quickly these numbers change. And as Brian has mentioned, they are also very much dependent on how we measure, how we define loneliness and social isolation. But here, the statistics from Age UK and the Campaign to End Loneliness suggested that in 2016, there were 1.2 million chronically lonely older people in the UK, and that at least 500,000 of older people went at least 6 days a week without seeing or speaking to anyone. And naturally, these numbers are probably much higher now due to the pandemic. And as Brian has mentioned in his presentation, we know now that loneliness and social isolation are a significant societal and public health problem, And we're beginning to realize, or we began to realize, that it really affects different groups in the population and different age groups. And some of the ONS reports have also showed that this problem is really spread out across different age groups. So for example, here, 1 in 4 people aged 25 to 35 experience loneliness often, not always, some of the time, and 1 in 5 people aged 55 to 64, so here in green, experience loneliness often, always, some of the time. So then the question that we wanted to answer, and I think many other people were interested in trying to understand this, is, can the arts contribute to the prevention or alleviation of loneliness in those who suffer from it? And then secondly, to understand, can the arts be used to boost social connectedness or the feelings of belonging in the society? And if so, how? So once more, we were able to look at these associations in ELSA. ELSA measures loneliness with the well-established UCLA 3-item scale, which asks these questions. So how often do you feel that you lack companionship, you feel left out, or you feel isolated from others? They are scored from hardly ever to often, and which leads to a score between 3 and 9, and participants who score 6 or above are considered to be lonely. So we set out to answer this question. So is arts engagement associated with lower odds of reporting loneliness in a cross-sectional analysis, and also over time? So in a cross-sectional analysis at wave 2, so in 2004 to 2005, in over 6,000 participants, we found that engagement with all these 3 activities was associated with lower odds of loneliness. So especially at the level of every few months or more often, that was associated with having lower odds of reporting loneliness compared to those who never engage. But for activities such as galleries and museums and concerts, theatre and opera, even engagement that once or twice a year was associated with slightly lower odds of reporting loneliness compared to those who never engaged. Oops. And over time, we found that the associations were most robust for the engagement with galleries and museums, as well as concerts, theatre and the opera. And here we found once more that participants who at the beginning of the study reported that they engaged with galleries and museums every few months or more often had significantly lower odds of of reporting loneliness a decade later compared to those who never engaged. And that association was still present even for an engagement once or twice a year. And once more here, I would like to highlight that as much as we could, we've controlled for different confounding factors. However, there is an overwhelming evidence that socioeconomic confounding is very much very difficult to control for in these analyses. And whenever we look at these associations, I think we always have to bear in mind how socioeconomic circumstances affect the people's access to these arts activities in the first place. Nonetheless, it's from these analyses, we can conclude that these art spaces, arts venues, and engagement with certain art activities can contribute to lower odds of developing loneliness. So it can really contribute to protecting people from feeling lonely and perhaps also boosting their levels of social connectedness, which is something we have addressed as part of our experimental work, which I'll just very briefly describe. It took place at the Great Exhibition Road Festival. It was open to people of different age groups, and we wanted to really have to have a quick look at whether participatory engagement can affect people's perceptions of social connectedness. One of the things that is sadly missing in a lot of the cohort studies is are the questions on participatory arts engagement. So for example, as we have seen now, ELSA measures predominantly receptive arts engagement rather than activities that people can actively take part in and can create the art themselves, such as singing, singing in choirs, or drawing, or engaging with literary arts. So this is something that we try to look at with this quick experiment. And also we wanted to be able to ask some questions on social connectedness that again are missing in most of the cohort studies. So this was the artwork. It's an interactive participatory art experience, which it's called Kima Voice by Annalima Group. And the artwork basically invites the audiences to find harmonies between their voices. And two participants can interact with the art installation by making sounds into a microphone. And then the installation interprets the mathematical relationships between the voices and displays that. And the additional feature that this installation has is that it encourages harmonies between people by giving them feedback about how they're doing through this beautiful visualization. So it gives them information about how they interact with the art from themselves, but also encourages that mutual collective experience. And what we found is that people did report increases in feeling connected and feeling in tune and feeling happy following the engagement with this participatory arts installation. And this small experiment, despite its scale, I think is very promising in showing how we can get really creative about how these creative activities can help to boost feelings of social connectedness in people. So the main suggestions from this work, I would say, are that to really, first of all, pause and think, are we capturing and representing arts engagement in the population well? And to always make sure that when we talk about arts engagement on the population level, we don't overlook the informal everyday arts and cultural participation, and that we reflect on the different ways in how we can support that activity taking place in the population. And that also policies that facilitate access to arts venues are really there in place to support the older people's access to them and sustain engagement over time. So for example, through the free admission schemes or improved public transport and investments in local cultural activities, we can already tell from the overwhelming amount of evidence that is out there that arts engagement can really benefit older people's well-being and their health. And I think now the questions should really focus on, since we know this, how we can support these activities and how we can also support people who manage these different art spaces and venues in directing the resources and programming towards facilitating opportunities for older adults socializing and having these shared experiences, and that can help to boost their feelings of social connectedness and hopefully protect them from feeling lonely and isolated. And I think I will end it here. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Ula. A lot in there, and I think it really reflects some of the underlying question, I suppose, for those of us interested in policy around loneliness and social isolation, which is sort of, well, if we've identified that these are issues to address, what do we do about them? So I think your presentation has been great to sort of give us a bit of flavor around the role that the arts play in that. Let's see. Going to now open up. I encourage everyone to put into the Q&A function any questions for Ula. We're going to take some time for anyone who wants to address specific questions to her. I think I'll go ahead and start it off, Ula, in just asking whether or not you have any kind of, if anything's happened over this year to sort of inform you and all of us interested in this about how these kinds of things are possible in this sort of lockdown world, or in this COVID world. How have these kind of engagement opportunities been impacted, and what's been the knock-on effect for older people? Have you been able to look and investigate that at all?
Yes, we have actually. We have run a quick online cross-sectional survey, and what we have found is, so we've run this survey in 2019. Actually, I stopped sharing my screen now. But yes, so as part of Hearts, we've also had an ongoing interest in how we measure arts engagement. And as part of that, we have come up with a slightly altered arts engagement scale that is still comparable to what is included in certain surveys, such as Understanding Society. But we've tried and we've hoped that it is a little bit more inclusive, and it's also a bit more up to date and more aligned with the current trends in arts engagement. For example, it might be difficult to believe, but the item on listening to recorded music is currently not captured in any ongoing national surveys. And as we all probably intuitively know, that's quite a common arts activity that probably we all engage in. So we, as part of this work, we have in 2019 run a survey. And what we could see is that, yes, indeed, reading and listening to music were the most popular activities. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we have repeated that survey. So we now have some data for 2020, so that will be coming up really soon. But I think overall what we saw is this shift as could be expected. So overall in 2019, we found that people reported that the engagement was biased towards the receptive cultural engagements, so going to events and going to cinema. So some of the items that are captured in ELSA, they tended to be the most predominant on the population level. But in 2020, for obvious reasons, that has shifted more towards the active, creative side of participatory arts on the whole, on the balance. We have not looked at these activities yet by the different age groups. That's something that we'll most likely do and report. So I would say stay tuned. We have also run a survey in artists themselves, in musicians, in different people who work in the creative and cultural sectors. So that is also a separate survey, and we've also have some data on that, and that's all coming out very soon, I think.
One of the questions that's come through, I think, relates to in improving our understanding of how to connect people to these opportunities. So in any of the work you've done, have you looked at the methods for informing members of the public to arts opportunities and events, whether this be certain, advertising in certain places, like the underground or buses or social media platforms?
The short answer is no, but yes, excellent question. We have, so during the process of deriving the arts engagement scale that we have used in our cross-sectional analysis, that was very much on our minds. Some of it, I think the main challenge for this communication and for this more integrated approach to understanding both access and engagement at the same time. I think that came, one of the reasons for that, for not being able to integrate that more into our epidemiological work on the population level, really came down to trying to come up with a definition of basically what type of activities we include and exclude from when we talk about arts engagement and cultural engagement. And that's in practice, that has been extremely difficult to do, which is why I think we have, to begin with, focused on just making sure that we have a very good and inclusive understanding of arts engagement, of how to measure that on the population level. And then I think the goal of that would be to open up these definitions more to the different cultural and leisure activities. And hopefully by the time, so that was, I guess, our approach, to really try to understand the different types of activities that people engage with, but more from based on the previous academic literature and based on previous scales used for measuring these type of activities. But it's a very valid point that in some ways that process could have been informed by the type of activities that are currently advertised for, or that yes, I think that would be, so this is not a very clear answer. But I think
No, it's fine. I mean, one of the things that I think it points to from my perspective is that sort of recognition of the sort of pockets of opportunities for what one might call cultural participation. And so, you know, for example, many museums are in cities, and therefore within cities, there are more opportunities to advertise and reach people who reside in the city, perhaps more challenging to reach those who don't live in the area where the opportunity is being provided. But you sort of, you linked back to, I think, another question that's been raised. And I don't know if you have an answer here, but do you have a sense of whether or not there is a sort of, does it make a difference if the material that's included in any one of these kind of interventions is directly related to the sort of older people's own past? So we've seen some examples where it harnesses like people's memories and, you know, highlights those. Do you know of any work done around whether the extent to which that makes a difference?
That's another very good question. I think so. In some ways, this field is, I think there was this explosion of interest, and it came from different disciplines and at the moment, I think a lot of the evidence is out there, but it's not really organized in a way that this information is very easily accessible, because sometimes when you research for something with your disciplinary background, it's really hard to know how to find this information in other disciplines. But I think in general, some of that, and also I think that relates to the best methodologies that we should really apply for to understand these questions, because to understand the life course, someone's life course, arts engagement, that is actually something that could be answered with epidemiological methodologies. So I think, for example, in the 1946 birth cohort, that might be a good data set to get an idea of someone's someone's life course experiences in participation. But to go back to the previous question, I think in some ways what we would need is like a cultural census of what's happening right now, and that was really, I think, challenging to do from the point of view of epidemiology, where we had to rely on secondary data analysis, because there's obviously always a lag between when the data was collected for and what we know now. And some of that problem, some of the challenge of having this up-to-date cultural census was really about about this question that is in the chat about what is the most, is there a data set that we can access for this type of information about advertising and what's happening now? So we've tried to, I think we kind of tried to kill two birds with one stone with our HEARTS 2019 and 2020 cross-sectional surveys, just to get a snapshot of what's happening right now in the population. But the way we've asked the questions, we wanted to ask them in a way that would be able to be traced back or cross-checked with some of the epidemiological data. So there's always this compromise around staying aligned to the previous work, but then allowing for aligning the data collection to the current trends. And I think for arts engagement in particular, that is very challenging because that is obviously the creative field is always moving, and there's always these different types of activities that are appearing, and it's difficult to know, although some of them are more trendy and they have become more visible, so perhaps that's why we focus on them more. But it was quite challenging to come up with a very inclusive, I don't know if that's even ever possible, to really capture the state of the creative field with the cultural senses. But I think there is an interest in that, and there are different people, different academic and non-academic institutions working on this. So hopefully very soon we'll have these very robust, systematic, and connected data sets.
Yeah, great. So, so I'm going to go ahead and invite Noriko and Tarani to join us for our broader panel discussion. And I want all of those of you watching, please do send in more and more of your questions. I see Noriko has been responding to lots of them. So, you know, there's some sort of direct answers for you there. But I've certainly noted them and will sort of incorporate them into our broader conversation. I want to start off coming directly to you, Ula, but you know, Noriko, Tarani, do join in. Ula, it's related to the final question that was posed toward you around engagement with specialist charities and NGOs focused on the arts, for example, arts for dementia. And so I want us to sort of reflect on the implications of our work here, the implications for understanding and fostering social connections when it comes to people with dementia. What are your thoughts, Ula?
Yes, throughout the HEARTS project, we've been in touch with many of these charities, and they're all really fantastic, and they do fantastic work. I think they should be, my only thought is that they should be really supported in what they're doing, and I would love to actually hear from them to know how our research could be better aligned with their needs. We were not able to do any data collection with them. We've had a lot of our these types of field studies plans for 2020, which was the last year of our project, and they naturally didn't happen. But it would be great to hear any suggestions on how we can be of service.
Yeah, so if anyone out there watching has works for those or as connections directly with them, do put us in touch via the SOCA network or contact Ula directly. So, I mean, Noriko, I know that the dementia, you know, it's an issue that's, you know, of interest and of pressing interest in every country that's looking at addressing aging. What are your thoughts on how, you know, any lessons to learn, let's say, from Japan or vice versa around how to ensure that dementia doesn't cause, you know, complete deterioration of social relationships?
That's very good questions there, because Japanese demographic have changed significantly. Because people tend to get married late, or even these days in Japan, people are marrying. So there is the really significant increase in population of never married population. Also, in contrast, there are people who lived by themselves the solo living, I call the increasing. So in a way, the social connection is relationship, especially family ties deteriorating in Japan. The like common 3-generation household is decreased. So what in Japan's the current picture is very bleak, and because of that, there is the increasing problem of dying alone. That's like the people died suddenly. Nobody notices. So in that aspect, we really in the UK have to watch what Japan is going through, because that's the aging, the growth of the aging, the speed of the aging population growth. It's like the 20 years that we are following up the 20 years of the in a pace the Japanese the aging the population growth. But that's not what I meant by the we should get married and we should have a children to not be disconnected. But it's more likely in the future we are more kind of maybe really want to connect any other way, especially not with the non-family members. I give the example about the Japanese initiative called the Mimamori. That's volunteering the services that they are checking up in the community, checking up the solo living the elderly. I think that's the voluntary scheme. But then they like the area level connection. It's more becoming more important to facilitate the healthy aging, and also helping people not falling to the further dementia by kind of not relying on family members to do the connection, but we really have to involve everybody. I think the future will be we have to think about in the future.
And to Ronnie, I mean, do you have anything to say around the impact of shifting populations with dementia on our ability to make good assessments through surveys? Is that something that you have any kind of familiarity with?
Not a huge deal of familiarity, but a little bit. So yeah, it's really important to acknowledge the fact that an increasing proportion of our older population will be facing conditions like dementia, but it's also just as important to recognize that that it's not just a one-way street. That and especially when we're considering conditions like frailty and dementia, that there are pathways to different endpoints. So I'm a bit more familiar with the frailty literature, and here there's a lot of strong evidence that that the transition from a non-frail to a frail status is not a linear transition, that people can recover from a pre-frail status to a non-frail status, for example. So it's and I'm less familiar with the transitions to dementia, but I am aware of research literature that also says that it's with dementia diagnoses, it's really hard to get a dementia diagnosis in the first place. So usually it's cognitive impairments that are noticeable to some extent or a greater extent, and depending on how noticeable they are, people and depending on access, people get diagnosed. So I think the focus on disease is not the sole focus. So I don't want us to be completely distracted by saying, yes, we've got to provide all these services for dementia patients, because who gets diagnosed? I mean, so it's really about trying to prevent people from becoming increasingly more frail or increasingly more cognitively impaired. And that's what a lot of the research that we do, Noriko does, that you do, Brian, I see you can. It's about the prevention of people from deteriorating even further. That's why we need the longitudinal research. And so the focus is very much on hopefully preventing a dementia diagnosis, but also on recovery and prevention, from going from a pre-frail to a non-frail status, for example.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we growing consensus around the importance, as you say, of prevention, and sort of doing what we can to prevent deterioration in whatever form that may be, and of well-established body of literature around the role of social determinants of health. Within that, I wondered, a number of people have asked about elements of housing, and by extension, sort of neighborhood situations, how that relates to capacity for social integration, how that relates to availability of health and care services, and even a comment from just a few minutes ago, a question around how seasonal variations in weather impact people's willingness to go out. To what extent, I'll start with you, Tarani, and get perspectives from all of you around the extent to which we can accommodate some of these, or the extent to which we already recognize, measure, investigate this question of sort of housing and neighborhood design as we understand changes in social connections.
Yes, so here I'm aware of a couple of key research evidence literatures. So on the housing front, you're right, extremely important. So here we've got really good quality evidence coming out from randomized controlled trials of housing interventions where from New Zealand. These studies have been done for over 10 years now, and they show that improving the housing of older people, largely through heating and insulation, has a markedly improvement on their physical and subjective well-being as well. So clearly, there's a lot of strong lessons to be learned from improving housing conditions, I guess not just for older people, but for lots of people. And the second piece of evidence that I'm aware of, because I research on this, is on public transport use. So here there's again really strong evidence that that improving the access to reliable public transport, so we're talking about buses here, really improves the social connections of older people. Not only that, it sort of prevents the deterioration in physical mobility, because it encourages older people to walk more. So it's such an important dimension to the design of public transport, urban settings and housing settings, for older people's well-being.
And Noriko, in some of the work I do around housing, more and more often I'm asked questions around multi-generational housing, and I've certainly people have asked me about the prevalence and the practices of multi-generational housing in Japan. Do you know anything around sort of the trends with multi-generational living in Japan and how that impacts positively or negatively social connections?
Yes, as I mentioned, the previous questions, the 30 years the space, the three generations household is really almost disappeared. In Japan, on the other hand, couple owned housing, and also the solo living housing, because the married couple lost their spouses and becoming a solo living. So that population is increasing, and yes, so that is quite becoming a problems. And in terms of the housing, then I'm not an expert on this, but it is more the urban area. It's more housing, it's small, and it's more designed for the small family household. So therefore, it is more the not much huge difference, but the rural area that they are still having a very housing designed for the 3 generations. Now they are, left with the, like elderly couple that might be difficult for them to maintain and they maintain the house, the large housing that is the problem. When like the elderly couple left in their rural community, that even they are deserted by the younger people. So that's something that it's a problem in a rural area.
And Ula, I mean, I think, I mentioned just before around that sort of difference in access to cultural activities in rural and urban settings. But I mean, this question's been asked around, do we have ideas around how to address the challenge in getting people engaged culturally during sort of the colder months where older people may be less likely to leave their homes? Do we have any evidence perhaps from the COVID experience of online delivery that is a way of bridging these?
Yes, certainly. Yes, I saw Tony's question. I think that's an excellent suggestion. And again, a lot of these things go back to how we measure and define arts engagement, because in terms of the difference between rural and urban areas, some of the evidence actually suggests that there's more arts engagement in the rural areas. And that's mainly down to the everyday community arts participation and more of that side of participatory arts. So people actively inventing the arts themselves, or actively participating in the arts creation rather than going to cultural events like some people might do in the cities. So again, I think it's not always very straightforward comparing access to these activities in rural versus urban areas, because the types of activities vary, and that's naturally they will vary. I'm really curious to see how the pandemic and how these different initiatives of online streaming, whether they will stay with us post-pandemic or not, and whether they will be used for the greater good of increasing the access. I think that's an excellent opportunity. If anything good can come out from this pandemic, is to really perhaps make the access to arts fairer and more equal. But that, I guess, naturally will need to go hand in hand with initiatives to support older adults' access to technology and their use of technology. But if I'm not mistaken, I think it looks like we are going to have a platform for, at least I think for National Theatre, it looks like it's going to stay with us. So we'll have a Netflix for National Theatre shows, which I think it's a wonderful idea. And it's a shame it hasn't happened sooner. Why didn't it? It's a brilliant idea. And to obviously there's a lot of screening initiatives already in cinemas across the world of a lot of the National Theatre shows. But whatever we can do to make them even more inclusive and more accessible, I think these are all great ideas. And the epidemiological evidence is there to support that it will boost our health and well-being at the same time. So,
well, we're quickly running out of time, and I want to give each of you a minute to just sort of give your final comments. I will highlight, I mean, we've got some topics we haven't precisely touched on, although thank you so much, Noriko, and whomever else might have answered them directly in the Q&A function. But I'm particularly interested around sort of what our lessons are for understanding the implications from an intergenerational perspective, how some of this ties into our broader concerns around ageism or respect for people of all ages, and even, by extension, whether or not this links to questions around lifelong learning. So a lot of interest coming from our audience around that. I just wanted to highlight for you, but let's take a minute to give us your final thoughts. Please, Ula.
Oh, actually, can I have a minute to think about it?
Yeah, sure. Tarani, do you want to go?
Okay, so I think it's really important to learn from other countries, and I think in the Japanese context, there's much we can learn from, but just a word of caution, we can't just take programs and policies wholesale from the Japanese context and use them in the UK context. It's really important to understand what is it that makes it work in certain contexts.
Great. Ula, you ready?
Yes, I am actually, thank you. I think on that point, I wish I had some concrete data to share with you, but I think in terms of the research on arts engagement, I think we're in the process of doing that. So the heart survey will be repeated in other countries with the primary focus on the aging populations. So I think I'll echo Tarani's point that that we need to look at the data coming from different countries, both individually, and then be very careful with how we assess them collectively. But I think we shouldn't lose touch with the developments and how things look like in other places.
Great. And Noriko, your final comment.
Oh, thank you. I think every good answer is taken. I would like to say even you think the problems are other countries, but it's really related to us. And I think given the COVID, problem, the lockdown and the increasing mental health problems and the loneliness, and we are now becoming more focusing on how we can be related with the people and how this is valuable to our mental well-being and also physical well-being. And now we have the interest to how we can combat against the socialized kind of mechanically enforce the social isolation upon us. So it's not about the elderly, the older people's problem, it's everybody's problem now. So I think for me, this event is for us to realize we have problem now, that we have data to look at it, and we can validate using the data across the country to see what we can learn from each other and what would be helpful to all of us.
That's great. I think that's a really important and key point for us to end on, which is that we do now have tools, well-established tools for conducting the kind of investigations and research that will lead us to coming up with solutions and answers to these problems. So I want to thank Ula, Tarani, Noriko. I've learned so much through this project, and it's been a wonderful experience to work with you. And I thank you for sharing this with our audience. Just to also, as part of closing, I want to remind those of you who are attending, most of you should have seen when you signed up an opportunity to join us for our afternoon workshop. This will be a chance for us to speak more directly through a meeting format in breakout sessions to talk about the key issues around social relationships that we're working on and we're interested in, potentially even get answers to some of the more thornier questions around how to apply different measurements and access data, things like that. If you should have received a link to join the workshop today, maybe while we've actually been on the webinar even. But if you've looked and you haven't received it, or you didn't initially register but would like to join us, just please email me. I can share a link with you for to join today at 2 o'clock. That said, this has been a very interesting piece of work for us to do in collaboration with these esteemed guests from whom you've heard today. We at ILC are always interested in opportunities to collaborate and work. There are different ways that you can work with us, as you see there on the screen now. If you want to get in touch to discuss further, do contact my colleague Redvers, whose email is there at the bottom of the screen. But with that, I will say thank you again to Ula, Tarani, and Noriko, and we hope to see you this afternoon.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Brian. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.